having a little fun about the chair a moment ago, it reminded me of the tale about a little lady about 6 years old who'd been taken by her mother for the first time to a service in an evangelical church, extremely evangelical church, charismatic and very excitable, and it had one of those lovely rails round the pulpit, those Victorian-style raised dais pulpits with a metal rail, and they had an incredibly enthusiastic preacher who was either punching the Bible or shaking the rail or pointing fiercely at somebody and saying, "Are you saved?" The little girl was getting closer and closer and closer to her mother and finally whispered, "Mummy, what will we do if he gets out?" Also, I tend to pace about without actually shaking the pulpit, unless it's at Rennes Chateau, then I fall through it. And the other little yarn I would like to begin with before we get on to some serious unsolved mysteries is the tale of a guy who was always known as the Jacksonville Preacher. You know, Jacksonville in Florida is a very religious little town. This goes back to sort of, oh yes please, I'm getting sign language from a lovely brother here.
Tea, coffee?
Coffee please, Gary, if I may. Thank you. Delling.
I'll go and get some coffees for you.
And so there in this little town of Jacksonville, which is a very fundamentalist Bible Belt town, there is a very pious gentleman who went fishing one day when he felt he ought to be doing more worthwhile things, and he felt it was a sort of divine punishment that there was a sudden, very minor flash flood. The river came up 18 inches max. But he panicked, he grabbed a tree, he let his canoe disappear down the river, and from then onwards, he lived to be nearly 100, every sermon he preached in every little Pentecostal church for miles around Jacksonville began, "My brothers and sisters, I'm going to tell you how the Lord miraculously intervened, saved my life in the great Jacksonville flood of 1872. And by the time you've heard that X number of times, over the course of this old gentleman's wonderfully long life, people sort of flinched as he abandoned the up the steps. Eventually, full of good works, because he was a very innocent old boy, he dies, and St. Peter greets him at the pearly gates and says, "Do come in." Now, let me show you. So this is the public address microphone of heaven, and because you've been such a good man, and been a preacher for so long, you have a special privilege. You can have the microphone for 2 complete minutes. There are millions of saved souls up here. What do you want to tell us? And he said, "Well, St. Peter, I'd like to tell all the people here about how the Lord saved me in the great flash floods, 1872. Peter wipes his head and says, "It's your choice, but Noah is sitting there." Now, when I have the privilege of being invited to address a group of pals who share my interests in science fiction, in fantasy, in unsolved mysteries, and the like, I always remind myself that we are very much a group of pals discussing it, and this is not me as an expert. There is many a Noah and Noah-S in my audience. I'm only the Jacksonville Preacher. But I will tell you about the little flash floods that I've investigated from time to time. And perhaps one that is certainly still unsolved as far as we're concerned, and very intriguing, is the Barbados coffin mystery. We went over to Barbados a year or two back. We were lucky to manage to inveigle a little commission out of the Beam to go and make a programme about the Barbados coffins. The basis of the story was this. In 1807, a mysterious vault, which is about, seen from the outside, it's almost exactly the size of our screen. There's a flight of steps, so if you can imagine that ground level is roughly where the tables are, or your eye level, that's what you would see as you walk through the churchyard. Coming down here is a flight of steps leading to the actual doorway of the vault, which is arched on the inside, but is dead flat when you look at it from the outside. And this flight of steps was originally sealed by a big, this will appeal to us all, of course, we're in Plymouth, Devonshire marble, the best, the most solid and the most heavy, and the really impenetrable stuff. So this huge slab of blue Devonshire marble seals the entry to the vaults. And unless your buddy on the other end is Schwartzy, you will not lift that very quickly on your own. It normally takes 4 guys, one at each corner, to hold it up, carry it to one side, and the coffin goes down the steps. Now, the story begins that in 1807, this vault passed into the keeping of the Chase Elliott family, and the first of the family died, was buried in there in 1807. Nothing particularly strange happened, it all seemed normal. Another member of the family dies, and to everybody's disgust and surprise, the first coffin had been moved. A few years go past, somebody else dies, third coffin is put down, big blue Devonshire slab is picked up, and the other 2 coffins have moved. This went on until 1819, a period of some 12 years, 13 years. Every time a Chase Elliott died, the other coffins had been moved. Now, these are not little 2 guys front and back coffins. These are Barbadian rich man's planter coffins, and they were encased in lead because of the climate. And if you didn't put something very substantial on them, they wouldn't last more than a matter of a few months in the heat and with the jolly little microorganisms and bugs that got to work. So everybody who was anybody was encased in lead. That brought the total coffin weight up to darn nearly a ton. So let us imagine that we were planning a practical joke, ruse or prank, and we said, hey, let's go down and throw the Chase Elliott coffins about. Nothing much else on tonight. I said, no, not really, let's go and fling a coffin. It would take at least 8 of us. It would need, because these things were not just shifted, they were found leaning against the wall. Now, this is the equivalent of 8 of us going outside, picking up that car which is blocking the park, and propping it against the hotel door with its nose in the air. It would require a fair number of fairly burly Devon lads to do that. And this rather sort of militated against the idea of a hoax, because you know how it is. No matter how much you've sworn each other to secrecy, somebody will have had a little drop too many one night and will say, hey, you know that mystery of those coffins? I can tell you it was me and Fred and Big Jack and Billy was with us, and thank you so much. That's great. And so, if you've got at least 8 men in on the secret, that secret is not going to be a secret much longer. There is an inverse correlation between the number of people who know about it and the security of the secret itself. So, on the fatal year of 1819, yet another Chase Elliott dies and is interred. And on this occasion, Lord Combermere, the governor, takes a hand. We need to investigate a little bit of the character of Lord Combermere, governor of Barbados in 1819. He had fought alongside Wellington in the Peninsular War. He had been a cavalry commander. Whatever else he was not a wimp. And neither was he particularly patient. Cavalry commanders, I believe, are not noted for their patience and tranquility. So our good buddy Lord Combermere, who is now in charge, grabs the local vicar, a one Thomas Alderson, Doctor of Divinity, and says, Father Alderson, when we've laid this chap to rest, I want to put sand on the floor, I want to test the vault, I have a stonemason with me who'll do it, and I then want to seal it. When we put the slab back, we'll cement it in place, and furthermore, I will ask half a dozen of you good friends who are with me to make a mark or put your signet ring in the wet cement, and behold, they did. So we've now got a vault 8 foot by 12, down 14 steps, roughly this size, and that vault has got a sanded floor. Its coral stone block walls have all been checked, and there is no way that a mouse could get in there. And of course, that Chase Elliott family was singularly inconsiderate and uncooperative. Nobody died. And so His Lordship the Governor says, I can't wait. They've been down there 3 months. If anything was going to happen, it would have happened. Right, Father Alderson. Poor old Alderson trotting along behind the Governor. Yes, Lord Combermere. No, Lord Combermere. 3 bags full, Lord Combermere. And he said, well, we could open it if you wish. I do wish. Get some men over here. And they checked the seals, which were intact. 4 burly lads lifted up the blue Devonshire marble slab. They didn't have to go down because one of the coffins was 3/4 of the way up, as if it was swimming up for air after the child died. Combermere said, that's it. He said, the French, I will charge. He said, I'm not charging whatever's down there. The Alderson, get them out. I want separate graves for the lot. And that's where they rest today. And Combermere gave the order in 1819 that the vault was to remain open. Nobody was ever to be buried in it again. And behold, nobody was. Well, when we went there, with the enthusiastic support of the Barbadian Tourist Board, they lent us a marvellous guy to look after us. He had won the title of Taxi Driver of the Year and Tourist's Best Friend the year before. Lovely guy called Emerson Clark, big fella, Barbadian, and took us everywhere, showed us everything, got us to the museum, found all the archives, enabled us to check up on ancient newspaper records. We really got our teeth into the research. And finally, as we were, it was a radio commission we got, I'm down in the vault, and Emerson is sort of standing on the top, peeping down the steps. And it suddenly occurred to me, he got a lovely, rich, baritone voice. I thought, this will sound superb on the broadcast. And Emerson, would you just come down and have a little word with me about it so I can get your voice on the tape? So you'll sound great. Eyes open very wide. I'm not going down there again. This is a guy who's 6 foot plus and could be a rugby prop forward. I'm not going down there. Not after what my grandmother told me. Oh, I said. So we, then he did a double take, and he looked at this Englishman who was nearly a foot shorter than he was. If you're there, I'll come. Emerson, that's the nicest compliment I've ever had. Come on down. So we then did a piece with him telling me some of the things that his grandmother had told him about all the horrors and evil spirits in the vault. And the other thing my director back at BBC had told me to do, see if you can get hold of either a voodoo priest or priestess or an obeah, which is a slightly diluted form of voodoo, or an obeah priest or priestess, and ask them what precautions they would take if entering the vault. Fine, I said, fine. And we had a terrible job. You know, when you read fiction about Barbados or Haiti, you sort of knock on the nearest door and a voodoo man jumps out. But when you're trying to find one with a microphone in one hand, they disappear. They're like snow on a hot day. You can't find them. They finally ran one rather reluctant obeah man to earth and said, no, you know, BBC England, and we're doing a programme about this mysterious vault and so on, and I understand that you're an expert in things mysterious and mystical religions, etc., etc., etc. And my director has particularly asked me to ask you what precautions or what should one do or not do in the mystical presence of whatever's in this vault. Looks at me and says, one thing, brother, one thing. Never, under any circumstances, take anything out of the vault. Nothing. I had in my jeans pockets a large lump of rock off the floor of the vault, which is now in our china cabinet and has been there for some time. Bear with me while I swing a little coffee. And So with this thing burning a hole metaphorically in the pocket of my jeans, he smiled and nodded, never told me how, and he was telling me horror stories about, oh, there was this investigator who came over and he took a stone from the vault. Smile, yes, yes. And he said he took the stone from the vault, and within weeks he was begging us. He wrote to a newspaper here, he wrote to the local government, and he said, please, please, I must get rid of it. It's caused me, this has gone wrong, that's gone wrong, everything's gone wrong. And he sent it back by registered express airmail, and the editor of the local paper trundled it down the steps of the vault back to its original site. So the one in my pocket wasn't jumping at all. Neither did I develop blisters on my knee. Anyway, the next thing was even stranger than the research and the adventures that we'd had. We've got a pal called Simon Probert, who is a funeral director, and of course being in the church you get funeral director pals who ask you to come and help out with the families they're looking after. So if we wrote down a list of our circle of immediate friends in Cardiff, about 8 of them would be funeral directors, and Simon was one such. And again, it's a profession in which you tend to become, what we say, very resilient and durable. Although he's a lovely, sympathetic bloke and totally sincere, undertakers usually have wonderful senses of humour and have to escape when they've done their professional work. And Simon was, I said, an ideal pal and a great mate of ours, and he said he went to Barbados to a friend's wedding, and his partner Pam, a very psychic lady, and when they got to the vault, which is at Oyston, Christchurch in Barbados, he wanted to go down and have a look, because there it stands, you know, you can walk into it like you could walk into a hotel foyer or a pub. There's no restriction on it, it's just there, it's available, one of the tourist attractions of Barbados. And suddenly Pam, who was the psychic lady, said, I'm not going down there, Simon. I'm getting the most awful negative vibes out of that place. I'm just not going down. Simon said, okay, fine, if you don't want to, I will. So he handed Pam the camera. It had 36 exposures thereon, and they'd taken some already, and they took some others later. And 1 out of 36 failed to come out. I will just finish the last mouthful of this. His fluid tones continue. So if you can imagine, here are the steps as I was suggesting with the vault here. Simon goes down the steps till he's sort of head and shoulders visible at ground level. Pam is there with the camera, and he does, as we all are tempted to do on holiday, one of those little hello, have a nice day sort of wish you were here sort of moves. And he's standing with his hand up to the camera, and that sort of inane grin that we do when somebody's taking a picture of us on a beach. And that was the only one that never came out. He has a friend who, like many of my pals here, was a computer specialist, and he said, I'll enhance it for you, Simon. And he did all sorts of weird things with his enhancement program. And Simon brought us the picture. Where he should have been, there was a cloud of what can only be described as Victorian-style ectoplasm, and a grinning skull with the ectoplasm sweeping back from it like clouds on a summer day. And he said, what do you make of that? He said, it terrified my computer friend. He wouldn't do it again. He just did that one. And thank you, Simon, I don't want to see any more of that. And it is one of the most weird... Which one was it in, Chris? That's the one we haven't got here, sorry. It's the one we're waiting to get some more copies of, right. But it was the world's greatest unsolved, yeah. It's on the list of, on the leaflet, should say world's greatest unsolved mysteries. I bet it doesn't, because it wasn't there when we photographed it, was it? Yes, it is, it's that one. Those of you who've got leaflets, those who haven't, please come and get one at the end of the talk. And it's in that one there. Simon gave me permission to reproduce it. It's can I just ask, let's do that now, if anybody didn't get one of these last night, can I trouble you to just start them off and pass the rest on? Please, thanks. Anybody who hadn't got one, because it's in the, then I can be certain which book it's in. But it is, of all the weird stuff we've looked at over the last 40-odd years, that picture from World's Greatest Unsolved Mysteries is, I think, the singular, most amazing thing that we've ever seen. I do not know, okay, we could say, trick of the light, trick of the computer enhancement process, but I know Simon is totally genuine. I know that the account he gave me of standing on the steps and grinning at the camera is perfectly genuine. And that's what came out. And the other 35 were perfectly normal. Some were taken before, some were taken after. It wasn't as if it was the very first exposure or the very last one. It was just darned odd, and I can explain it in no other way. Pat and I, who are normally very dependent upon the presence of somebody who is a sensitive psychic, felt nothing. In fact, when we were down there, we said with a chuckle, I've seen Welsh woodsheds that are more frightening than this. And it was just like standing in a little bleak old cellar. It does just tie in with my mind. I said, it's never been solved. Nobody knows why those coffins move. It would be very, very good to conduct a proper scientific experiment. You know, if you had a big rollover win on the lottery and could afford to do it, to put several lead cases full of meat down there, you know, from a local Barbadian butcher, so they are of the equivalent weight, seal the place up and leave them, and see whether anything was trying to walk upstairs by the time we opened it again. But there is undoubtedly something very, very strange indeed, whether it is paranormal in the psychic sense or whether it's just some aspect of the natural sciences that we have not yet fully understood. One thing was very odd indeed. It was only the lead coffins that moved. One poor girl had committed suicide. She was a Mrs. Thomasina Goddard, who was related to the Chase Elliots. Her coffin was wood, and her wooden coffin finally disintegrated, which was the reason why most of them were encased in lead, and they propped it against the wall, bound up with wire. Whether there was any of Mrs. Thomasina Goddard still inside it, the records didn't say, but that had certainly been propped up. And that was the only one that didn't move. Now, are we looking at some curious force which can affect non-ferrous metals but doesn't affect, well, no, I don't know, I'm not a good enough physicist to know if any such force exists. But I think perhaps in 100 years' time somebody will solve the Barbados coffin mystery by saying, yes, it's on this spectrum of this or that or the other electromagnetic convolutions that we didn't know about in the year 2001 or 2 or 3. But the other little tale that goes with that, in the sense that it was down at a depth in Stonegate in York. They are in the process, in fact Jonathan Gaynor, the astrologer, owns the building, and they are in the process of turning it into a psychic museum, because York is rich in tales of ghosts and spectres and Roman armies that march across cellars and disappear because their legs are on a road that's at a different level from the present floor of the cellar. And it's one of those old buildings, going back to the 13th century, and I was asked to take part in a bit of research and some filming there with Uri Geller. And so Uri and I go down, we're co-presenting this thing, we go down into the cellar where the mysterious apparitions have allegedly been seen and heard, and this was only a few months back. And we get down, and the cellar was roughly the same size as this Barbados vault. They were trying to prove something or other about the investigation by making sure that neither Uri nor I had been told anything about what the archaeologists had seen and found there and what the psychics who had been there before us had said. I can say with my hand on my heart, I hadn't a clue about what had allegedly gone on down there. Uri struck me as a very interesting and honest guy to work with, and he said he didn't know either. Each of us went in separately to this allegedly haunted cellar, and although a ghost has to have the power of a pile driver to penetrate my incredibly tiny psychic ability, and I'm usually totally dependent on a medium or a sensitive to tell me what he or she can see when I'm investigating these allegedly haunted places. But I got, first of all, a sensation that somebody in that corner of the cellar was cowering in terror from some great brute of a man standing over her with either a whip or a leather belt. And the feeling of despair, of terror, I didn't see anything physically. It wasn't about getting a sort of hologram of whatever was there, but what came up with these waves of, I am terrified, I am in despair, you know, life couldn't get any worse, and the brutal, mixed with sort of brutal anger and ferocity. And I came back, I waited till jotted this down, got Yuri's ideas on it as well, and both of us had got the same impression, independently, that somebody had been chained in that cellar and had been brutally hurt by some foul interrogator perhaps, or somebody who was exacting a cruel revenge. Well, when we both said what we had felt, Jonathan Gaynor comes along and picks up from a box in a drawer a length of chain, a shackle. And he said, this is what the archaeologists found when they were digging up this floor. Somebody was chained down there in that corner. And we looked at it, it was just so odd that someone who is, as I said, psychically not very perceptive should get the same feeling, and Yuri, who I believe is genuinely very psychically sensitive, had the same picture, that some poor little teenage girl was chained in that corner and was being most horribly brutalised and abused by somebody for reasons separated from us by 700 years. But that bit hasn't been filmed yet. As and when it comes out, you know in advance what Geller and Lionel saw down in the corner of the cellar. But it was rather odd that I didn't feel anything in the Barbados 2, where Pam Wilson, Simon's partner, had been terrified to go. She said that the vibes there are so bad, I'm not going down there. And then we got the weird photo that Simon took, and then in this cellar in Stonegate in York, next time you get a chance to go to York, the Psychic Museum should by now be open. They're working hard on it, and if you just say, Lionel told you how interesting it was, and you might even get him free. Tell them your friends are mine and you'll get him free. So, yeah, I'll have another quick mouthful of coffee, and then I will launch into the Crogling Grange vampire, because that's one of those lovely tales. Yay! One of those lovely tales which has, and now you see it, now you don't, now you see it again. It's like a three-tiered sandwich, you know, you get the burger and the cheese. Now it all begins, and if any of us have the time, and I do say that as a warning, because it's a 3-volume work, it's called The Story of My Life by Augustus Hare. And he was writing at the end of the 19th century, and he's the guy who first brought the story to the knowledge, you know, to the attention of the general public. Now, dear old Augustus had a female relative who was marrying Captain Fisher, and this good lady had invited cousin Augustus to the wedding reception, and Augustus and Captain Fisher took a liking to each other and were propping up the bar for most of the reception. Now, I think that's the reason why the Augustus Hare version of The Vampire of Crogling Grange came to be just a little bit dislocated from the historical facts. But the way he wrote it was this. The Fisher family owned Crogling Grange, also known as Crogling Low Hall, which is not far from Penrith, up in the just north of the lakes up in Cumbria, and they had business interests in London. They were trying to sell the place and couldn't, because it was a single story, very bleak, lonely, no mod cons of any sort. And so, in despair, they let it out on a 7-year lease. It was taken by a brother and two brothers and a sister, Amelia and Michael, and I'm trying desperately to remember the other brother's name. We called him Joe now, though that wasn't it. But it was Edward. Edward. So there was Mike and Edward. Ed being the big guy, Mike being slimmer, athletic, quite a fair young fella, but nothing like the gorilla build of his brother. Bedroom window and sees something rather threatening and sinister moving in a stealthy way towards the house. It comes to her window. We assume that maybe there was a lighted candle there. It was attracting that whoever it was could see the light from her bedroom. And when she saw more of its details, she described the thing as a kind of living scarecrow. She was terrified of it, and screamed blue murder as it started to unpick the lead panes of her casement, backed up to the door because she daren't take her eyes off it. You don't have the trouble with these, but if you're wearing an ordinary tie, if you've ever tried to tie a friend's tie because his arm is in a sling, the only way I can do it is to get behind him, because otherwise everything is backwards. If you're trying to tie someone else's tie from the front, left is right, right is left, over is under, and the whole lot is Alice through the looking glass. And poor Amelia Cranswell was in a similar state. She got her hands behind her back trying to unlock the door, and she locked it and dropped the key. Now, I don't blame her for that, because if there's a thing like a walking scarecrow picking away at your bedroom window, and you are a sort of normal-sized lady and not China O'Brien, you don't really think that you want to be in the room with it for very long. Her screams had woken Ed and Mike, who were a couple of sturdy lads, but they couldn't get through the locked door. Big, old, heavy doors in that kind of house. By the time they broke it in, the thing was making its escape out of the window. Amelia, covered in blood, was unconscious on the bed, having been bitten all down one side of her face and throat. And we're back, at least in the 19th century, there are no antibiotics. In fact, Mr. Lister and Mr. Pasteur have only just been making people aware that bugs exist. And her life was in the balance from the poison from these horrible bites for several weeks. When she turned the corner, the boys took her convalescing to Switzerland. Now, not only are the Swiss experts at watches and timepieces, they're also expert gunsmiths. And Amelia was not only a very intelligent woman, she was a woman of great courage. She said to the boys, "We're not going to waste 6.5 years of a lease that we've just paid for. We're going back. Ed, the big one, I want you in the bedroom opposite me, just across the corridor. I want both doors permanently open. We will now go to the Swiss gunsmith and buy 2 pistols. You will have one, Mike will have the other. Mike will have the bedroom next to the front door. If I scream, Ed, I want you beside me with gun number 1, faster than you've ever moved before. And Mike, I want you out of the front door, cut off its retreat and shoot it." She would have made a very good general, this lady. Good girl. And lo and behold, Chummy came back. and Amelia screamed her heart out. Big Ed was beside her as promised in about 3 seconds flat, very angry, very defensive, got in on hand, where is he, you know. And there he was at the window. He suddenly saw that he was up against a big bloke with a gun, decided that he didn't want any blood that night, and lost all his appetite all of a sudden. And at that point, Mike, keeping up with his part of the plan expertly, at point blank range, didn't want to get done for murder, so he deliberately fired at his leg. And the thing screamed in a very unsupernatural way, grabbed its wounded leg and limped off to a nearby churchyard, where Mike followed and saw it disappearing into a vault, slamming the door behind it. He now has an empty pistol. He knows this thing is capable of biting like Hannibal Lecter, and he doesn't want to go in after it on his own. He doesn't know where Ed and Amelia are, or where there's any help coming, and this is where the whole story takes on a wonderful air of reality, and we see the seeds of truth. This bloke is behaving in a very natural and rational way. He has an empty gun, there's heaven alone knows what danger in there, and he waits indecisively. What do I do? If I go in after him, I have no illusions about my strength against his, and he's probably either insane or paranormal anyway. I'm not going in there alone, and my gun's empty. If I leave, he will get out and escape. He hung about for half an hour. There was no sign of anybody coming to help him, so he decided to go and get help. And he came back. You know those lovely old Hammer films we all used, well, those of us who are old enough used to enjoy. And there was always a gang in there that I referred to as the Hammer Film Studio Rent-A-Crowd. There would be the blacksmith with a hammer, there would be a couple of farm workers with pitchforks, there would be another bloke with a sickle, 2 or 3 young grooms and ostlers with horsewhips or riding crops or whatever weapon came to hand. And they'd all be standing around Dracula's cavern or standing around Frankenstein's castle, preparatory to burning it down with him in it, and all chanting angrily and shaking their assorted weapons and fists. Well, the gang that gathered outside this tomb to which Michael Cranswell led them back were a real-life version of the Hammer horror film Rent-A-Crowd. And finally, the 2 Cranswell boys, with various friends holding torches, ostlers, grooms, the blacksmith, big, hard guys, went in. And what they found was blood-curdling. There was an open coffin on a dais. And the thing in the coffin had obviously been dead for a long time. It was semi-mummified, but naturally mummified, with the air that had gone through the vault sort of desiccated it. But despite its ancient and very morbid appearance, there was fresh red blood on both hands and all around its mouth. And the boys said, "It's a vampire, we found it, it's definitely a vampire, that's what it was, that's what attacked our sister, let's get him." Now, between them they had amassed quite a lot of folklore from various parts of the world about how you destroy a vampire. One school of thought suggested that it should be beheaded. Another school of thought said, well, no, when he was in Greece, friends had told him that you had to take all the limbs off. I said, right, we'll do the lot then. Head off, limbs off. Let's do it properly. You know, sort of a union job, one out, all out. The union method of vampire destruction. And the other one had got hold of the stake him down business, and the next factor was something about a crossroads, somebody remembered, and then burning the pieces. So in the most elaborate of vampire disposal rituals, this poor innocent corpse, who had no more to do with attacking Amelia than you and I did, is taken out of his box, is taken to the crossroads, is dismembered, is staked, and then burnt ceremonially. While they're doing all this post-mortem activity, somebody says, hey, look, and produces a pistol ball. Whereupon the Cranswells look at it in horror, and match it with the set that came with their Swiss pistols, and it's a matching ball because the lead was slightly greenish in tinge, and it was quite definitely the pistol ball that young Mike Cranswell had fired into whoever was out. Well, of course, that was, you know, what further need have we of evidence? That was it. They were sure they got the vampire, and they were even more sure they got the vampire because no one else was ever attacked in the village again. Oh, must have got him, they said. Yes, must have got him. No more attacks in Crogling, and as well as Amelia's bad experience, a number of sheep had been killed, and a number of other girls had been attacked, but had fought it off, whatever it was, or had shouted for help. Amelia wasn't the only one. She had just suffered more than any of the other attack victims. And I was doing this talk in Lowestoft, in East Anglia, and among the friends there was a young GP. And he said, Lionel, I've got an idea, can I share it? Come on, Doc, come and tell us. And what he said was this. His theory was that the thing that attacked Amelia Cranswell was perfectly normal, that it was a normal human being, but insane. It was a psycho. And the guy had made his den in this old tomb, rather like the man in the New Testament, whose name was Legion and who dwelt among the tombs. And some forms of extreme melancholia could lead to that, to finding a den among the dead. And he said, when he went and attacked Amelia, tried to attack Amelia the second time, and cocked young Mike's pistol ball in his leg, he made it back to his den, realised there was somebody outside that he wasn't certain, and they had this kind of Mexican standoff. Nobody, the man on the inside doesn't know what's out there, and the guy outside doesn't know what's inside. And he said he managed to work the pistol ball out of the flesh wound on his leg, shoves it into the leg of the corpse, thinking, they want a vampire, I'll give them a vampire. And there's no shortage of blood, it's pouring out of his leg. So he wipes it on this semi-mummified corpse, peeps around the door, sees that young Cranswell isn't there, and goes. Now, the doctor then said the reason there were no further attacks was that this poor vagrant with the mental illness had given himself gangrene. He had been handling a corpse and then a huge open flesh wound on his leg. And then 3 weeks later, in another parish, he dies in a ditch, unknown and unnamed, and the parish poor law authority thinks, well, all we can do is bury him as cheaply as possible. He said, and the Crogling Hall vampire was the local psycho. Well now, as you know from our books, Trish and I always like to get up and investigate the thing at first hand. So, the first thing that we found when we visited Crogling was that it was 2 stories, not 1. So why the dickens was Amelia on the ground floor in the first place? Then we found that the church at Crogling had not been built till 1875, and it was in any case 2 miles from Crogling Green. So I'm a wounded psycho with a big bullet in my leg, and I'm going to run 2 miles to a church, which in any case didn't have any tombs. We went to the church, we went down the flight of steps, which was the only thing that looked as if it might have led to a tomb, and it was the Victorian central heating system. Very disappointed, it looked as if the whole story was a complete, utter and stupid fabrication and a terrible waste of time. Yet it was very persistent, and Augustus Hare was certain that Captain Fisher had told him about it. Then we re-investigated, and we went to see a lovely lady named Mrs. Johnson who farmed at Crogling Grange. And she showed us a bricked up window. That is the one, she said, which in tradition was Amelia's bedroom, through which the vampire came on his first attack. And then she pointed no further than the door of our room and said, there was something there once, I believe it was a church, because I cannot plough this field, I keep hitting stone. There had been a church within 50 metres of the house. It had been damaged by Cromwell's men during the Protectorates after he had beheaded King Charles, and that church had since been raided after Cromwell's men had damaged it. All the local villagers had come and taken bits of stone from the semi-ruined church until nothing was left. But the gravestones and vaults around it were now covered with uneven soil, and Mrs. Johnson said, I can use it for grazing, but I can't plough it. Oh, we thought. So there was a church within reach of the house, and then she played her ace and said, I'm not an architect, but an architect friend told me that this is a corbel. Any architects among us can confirm or assist me. And she said it's an indication that a building which was once single story has had another story added. Wow, we said. And then there was the problem which had occurred to me about the gun. Augustus Hare and Captain Fisher had told the story to each other, or Hare had misunderstood the story, as something that had happened round about then, in 1875, when he met Fisher at the wedding. Now, if it's 1875, those of us who have seen and enjoyed westerns will know that Mr. Eastwood and his confreres tend to use a very large, long-barreled thing with 6 chambers. Now, if you and I were the brothers who were going after the vampire, would we take an antique, single-shot, unreliable Swiss pistol, or would we take one of Mr. Todd's rather more lethal devices? Well, I know what I'd take, and I'd have let the vampire have all 6 chambers just to make sure. And 2 at least would have had silver tips. So, the gun now starts to make sense if we take the whole story back another century. It's nonsense in Victorian times because there are now 2 stories to the building, the church isn't there, and the gun is wrong. Go back to the 1600s or the early 1700s, the gun is right, it's only single story, and there's a church with a vault from here to the door. And it's now you see it, now you don't, oh, now you see it again. And when you find it, I talked to another researcher who'd written a marvellous piece of very deep and methodical work on it, and he said that what Captain Fisher in that late 19th century wedding reception had actually said to the somewhat bibulous Augustus Hare was, I'll tell you an interesting story, Augustus. One my grandmother told me, and it wasn't new in her day. So the 1875 Captain Fisher was telling Augustus Hare about a crawling vampire, which was a story from the 17th or early 18th century, and everything then slotted into place. So I say to fellow investigators and fellow lovers of the macabre and the paranormal, just because a good story apparently gets swept away by the first investigation, it's worth lifting the second layer of fabric just to see if there's something else underneath. Now, I know from what Dave said that there would be much demand for question and answer sessions if I could do that for you. Would you like to do that for the next half hour, folks? Is that what you, or any other favourite mystery that I've investigated that you'd like me to tell you, or a bit of both? Question and answer, everybody? Or yeah? And it'll probably remind me of another story anyway. So. Who would like to be first? Sir. Please.
Crop circles.
Yes, let's
What's
go.
your theory?
Theory of crop circles. Well, I find the whole field absolutely fascinating. Like, oh, unintentional. Freudian slip. Yeah. I find the whole field fascinating, especially the ones with the pictures in, yeah. No, the whole area is a truly fascinating one. What I think we've got to come in at first I'd like to tie this in with our own Exeter mystery of the devil's footprints alleged going back to the 1830s. And remember that February day in 1832, I think it was, without my copy of the Times for 1832, I can't be certain of the day. No, it was a February day in the 1830s when the mysterious trail of the so-called Devonshire footprints appeared. Lympston, Topsham, Exeter, they went right across the Exe. As good, Devon lovers, you will all know the tale of the footprints. Never been satisfactorily explained. And we can link that difficulty in a way with the crop circle problem. See, somehow a mysterious track or symbol or set of tracks either appears in a field in the form of a crop circle or a strange design in a cornfield, or we have this weird track, and we look at the theories that went with the Devonshire footprints for a start, and we say, well, either it was a gang of hoaxers, somebody had one of those trundle wheels, like the toy Donald Ducks that you could buy when I was little, which I remember my parents getting for me. You pushed the handle along, and Donald's feet were on a wheel, and as you pushed him along, one flat foot and then another appeared in this little cyclic style. Now, the Devonshire footprints could have been done by a team of friends. What they themselves were walking on, I don't know, unless they too had had some strange kind of footwear with these little 4.5 by 2.5 prints on the soles. But again, you're up against the problem of it would have required a great many people to do it. And as soon as you involve 20, 30 people making false tracks, it's only going to be the second pint of cider, and I would have confessed that I was one of the... I couldn't resist the temptation to say, I was one of the guys who did the hoaxes at Lympston. And...
well, I heard some of those tracks actually went across rooftops.
They did. This is the... This is why they were so interesting and why they've never been solved. They ran up where the snow had drifted against the side of a building. They were up here. Then they, of course, where there was just plain brick, they were not detectable. They appeared again on the rooftop, down the other side. They even at one of the most, if we could use this little table as a sort of shed with a broken front, they actually, exactly as you said, not only went over some of the things, but they went into the drifted snow and apparently out through a loose board on the other side, and then continued. So they went to all kinds of inaccessible places. They also seemed to have gone up to a door or a gate, and then turned and gone back the other way, as if they'd been reconsidering whether to actually go into the premises or not. It was a very, very strange thing. Now, if it was, let's look at the theories. If it was a hoax, which I consider extremely unlikely, it would have had to be very, very well perpetrated and involved. It was over 100 miles of these tracks. Now, how many of us would we need to cover 100 miles in a single night? And then there was the regularity of the track. They were almost exactly 9 inches apart, and the foot, in inverted commas, if it was a foot that had made them, was raised here. So it was as if you cup your hand and press that cupped hand into the snow, you've got the raised piece there, and it's you have a sort of a convex heap of snow with the horseshoe-shaped rim around it. It was because they were horseshoe-shaped that they gained the name of the Devil's Footprints with these little cloven hooves, which always reminds me of that wonderful story about the great St. Dunstan, who was a blacksmith, and a strange customer came to his door one day and said, I would like to have my hooves shod, whereupon Dunstan, who was a very tough character, yes, certainly, right, he didn't mind as long as he was going to get paid. So this strange cloaked figure with the horns under its hat raises its hoof. Dunstan pops 2 nice new shoes on. It laughs and cackles and says, I'm not going to pay, and starts dancing away from him. It had underestimated the good and great St. Dunstan, who caught its nose in a pair of red-hot pliers that he'd been using and squeezed until the devil paid. Hence the origin of the saying, to pay through the nose. to be forced to pay. But that was the tale of the good St. Dunstan, the blacksmith saint, and the devil. And so because the devil allegedly had these cloven hooves in all the medieval mythology, then the mysterious track across the estuary of the Exe was allegedly Satan. But I wanted to use that just as a quick parallel to come back to our main question about the crop circles. It is possible, and you will all have seen the accounts of a number of ingenious geometricians working with string and bits of wood, and they can be done that way, but not without an awful lot of trampling. If you actually look into the logistics of it, it is extremely difficult to do this with lengths of binder twine and bits of wood, and it can be not beyond human ingenuity to do it, but you can't do it without leaving several marks to show that human feet have been in the area. Now, unless you are wealthy enough to hire a helicopter and to lower yourself on a harness and do it with that while your pilot remains absolutely motionless above you, it would look very, I can assure you that if any of us tried to do that on a helicopter rope and harness, it would not be anything like those designs. It would look rather like those things, when your grandchildren are 3 and they draw you a lovely picture of a round circle, two eyes, 2 arms and 2 feet, and it says mummy underneath. And yes dear, it's very good. And then an even stranger one says daddy, that's even better. And you look at these things and you think, yeah, it's the work of an enthusiastic but as yet unskilled little hand. Now, the kind of crop circles that I would draw dangling on a helicopter winch harness would be rather like that. They would look like a 3-year-old impression of how to draw a humanoid. Now, what we need to consider then are the alternatives. Let us take the von Daniken-esque alternatives first, because it cannot be ruled out that they are some kind of... So all we can do with this is to look at all the theories and then come back to the ones we think are least improbable. Is it an alien visitation of some sort? Well, whatever. And I must declare interest at this point. Of course, I'm the president of Bufora, our British UFO Research Association. So I obviously, by being president of Bufora, accept that there is a possibility that aliens exist, and that there is a possibility that they've come to say, hi guys, have a crop circle, and then disappear again. So it is not ridiculous to consider the possibility that crop circles have been the work of an alien intelligence using technology beyond our present comprehension and trying to tell us something. When we look at the signals that we've sent, the things we tend to send are mathematical. And if you want to show somebody something mathematically, and you all know the wonderful story about the Oxford maths professor, famed in song and story, who was going through some differential calculus with his students, and to his embarrassed horror, couldn't solve the problem. So he excused himself at the end of the lecture saying he wasn't feeling very well and he'd finish it tomorrow. Went home, went to bed, and in the night had this very vivid dream of a green piece of chalk, or a green inscribing object on a black background, tracing geometrical patterns. He leapt out of bed, copied them down on any scrap of paper he could find, and went back to sleep. In the morning, he found that he had dreamed a geometrical solution to the calculus problem that he couldn't solve by calculus. And he went back, smiled at the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, what I failed to finish for you yesterday was and we should really have transferred to a geometrical pattern. Well done, Professor. Always been brilliant. His subconscious was better than his conscious. And you see, you've got that kind of pattern message, that pattern communication, just as the maths professor's subconscious mind gave him a solution to a problem that he hadn't grasped, gave it to him in a symbolic form. It traced it out. Now, non-verbal communication is usually far more effective than verbal. And I used to do this as an experiment with some of my sixth formers, with their permission. And I would get 2 volunteers out and say to the first one, I said, you just watch the non-verbal communication. I would lean over this unfortunate lady or gentleman who had bravely volunteered, using all the aggressive non-verbal stance, or stand in a threatening position, hideous expression on the face, and saying, I'm delighted with your work. In fact, if you go on like this, you're going to get a first. Now go sit down. So you said something very nice, but in a hideous voice, with aggressive non-verbal communication signals. To the next one, smile, put an avuncular arm around his shoulder and say, you know, you're one of the worst, the most stupid, and the most unpleasant students I've ever had. I'm going to fail you, and furthermore, I'm going to recommend that the Dean expels you this afternoon. Again. And the one, you know, the signals collide, and it is definitely the non-verbal which gets through to us most. And I'm wondering whether, if we do have alien intelligences out there, which statistically, I cannot believe that in a universe this big, there's only us. I really can't. It's statisticians are wrong sometimes, but I don't think they're wrong about that one. I would be very, very surprised. You know the old tale about the 2 sea monsters who had swum the oceans for millennia, and eventually in the middle of the Pacific, they meet each other, and 2 heads pop out of the water, and they say in unison, I'm so glad I met you, I want this wonder of the sea monster life. And it's the same with us and alien intelligence. I'm so glad I met you, I was wondering what an alien humanoid was like, an intelligent life form. Carry on. Yeah, right, okay. So, what we've got then is there a possibility that what we are looking at in the crop circles is an attempt to contact us in some way? And I think it might be. How do you contact? How would we, for example, if we came across a brilliantly intelligent life form which perhaps operated at a totally different metabolic rate from ours? You know, all the good science fiction stories that have been written about people whose metabolism is different by thousands of years. My favourite, I think it's by Theodore Sturgeon, but it may not be, and I bow to the wisdom of those who do know these things better than I do. A wonderful yarn of a poor chap who had accidentally landed, an Earth astronaut, landed on this otherwise very friendly and civilised and tremendously like us humanoid planet, except he'd landed in the one taboo zone, the penalty for landing in which is death. And the people who were extremely nice were terribly sorry, but we can't break the law. It's our religious law. Nobody goes there. You've got to be executed. And they said, you know, you're allowed one more night, and we will try and be as civilised as possible. You know, we'll supply you with 2 or 3 beautiful lady companions, and you can have your choice of food, drink, anything you want until morning. They go, well, that's like the most of it. And then he sort of looks at his watch and says, well, how long till morning? And one of them gets his computer out and says, according to our calculations, 11,000 Earth years. What a way to go! Now, if we take that little fun yarn, which I'm almost sure was Theodore Sturgeon, and we tie it into the difficulty of contacting other intelligences, is it possible that not only do we differ in the way we look, but in our metabolic rates, and that they may well, to us, if we think a mosquito buzzes past your nose, and the poor bloke is going to live his entire life by the time we go home and have a cup of tea, that's his life cycle gone. It's the equivalent of his 80 years. And suppose that we meet somebody to whom, you know, half an hour's casual chat is 150 years of our lifetimes, or vice versa, that this thing that we think is a mosquito comes zooming down and spends what he thinks is a very long time humming at us in a high-pitched whine, and has then communicated, so he thinks, all the knowledge of his system and culture. And if there is a time difference in our metabolism, if we're operating at different speeds at that rate, there would be an awful difficulty in contacting each other.
Now let's look at the mystery of the Devonshire footprints again, and the crop circles. What if whoever made them was operating at a different metabolic frequency? And so what seems to us to have been impossible to have done in one night was for him a period of 10 years, the equivalent, considering the relative timing, relative metabolic rates are so different. There are also theories about the different dimensions, and the bravest of the avant-garde physicists, we are inordinately proud of our elder daughter, who's a medical physicist and a PhD physicist, and who tells us all sorts of things that we don't really understand. And she has said that among some of the real avant-garde experimental physicists, there are quite serious theories put forward that there are at least 17 dimensions, never mind 3 or 4. And there's that wonderful phrase they use that she's shown us from some of the physics professional magazines that use the phrase, these are unfolding as the universe progresses. So it's almost as if the 3 dimensions that we're living in could sort of grow another one, or the 4 dimensions we're living in, growing another one, and then that one growing another one, rather like a flower unfolding. So that, as I think it was Sir James Jeans who said, the universe is not only stranger than we think, it's stranger than we are able to think. Because we're trying to interpret a multi-dimensional universe with 4-dimensional minds. And so it could well be that somebody who's popped in, let me try and give a better example of that. If we had, can you all see the picture of the yachts over here? There's a picture here with 2 yachts, for those of you who can't quite make it out from there. I am a 3-dimensional being, as far as I know, 4 dimensions including time. If these guys on these 2 yachts, painted on the flat picture, were alive and sentient and conscious, they would say I was doing something impossible because I'm touching both yachts at the same time. I've got an extra dimension. And they're all arguing with each other, how the dickens can that bloke do that, because he can't be in 2 places at once, and I am, in their little world. Now, if we think of our 3 physical dimensions, and somebody who's got 4, 5, 6 or 7, he could be in that chair there, in that chair there, drinking at the bar and asleep in bed all at the same time. And we would say, this isn't possible, this is magic. No, it isn't, it's just he's got an extra dimension or 2 that we haven't. So let's take the crop circles, and we say, it is not possible for that thing to be made overnight. And, oh yes it is, if you can be in 6 places at once. You can use your extra dimensions to do that piece, that piece, that piece, that piece, all at the same time. And what would be incredibly difficult for us, because if man in yacht number 1 wanted to get to yacht number 2, the 2 yachts would have to sail into each other, and he would have to walk across either a gangplank or get down in a dinghy and slide past. But for us, with our extra dimension, we simply put a finger on each of the yachts, and it's done. And for our multi-dimensional, hypothetical intelligences from elsewhere, that's all they've got to do. That they just come down and do the circle. So they could be perfectly genuine. They would be so difficult to hoax effectively. Then, of course, we have the idea of time travels. And what if you had time travel? How terribly easy. I want to leave, a timeline. I want to leave a little mark for you to show you. It wasn't you. Oh, I just swore it was you. But if we look at the possibilities then of extra-dimensional travel, of time travel, if we look at possibility of highly intelligent aliens, if we look at the difference between 2 different vibrations of the actual time. Remember how C.S. Lewis does this in the Narnia series, when the kids think that they've been away for 70 years or whatever, and they've actually only been away for 3 minutes of Earth time. And this is why dear old Professor Kirk, in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe and the other Narnia yarns, simply says, well, that's why I believe you. Because the time systems were different and apparently inexplicable, that's why I know you're telling the truth. You described the experience as you felt it. Anyway, best I can do on crop circles, I can't explain them, I'm mystified by them, I do not think that they are all hoaxes. Some may be. Well, you always get a copycat thing. It's rather like the, the art student who goes into the Tate gallery and does his or her best to copy some great masterpiece to improve his technique. And so you and I go along and see whether we can hoax one, find that our hoax is a very miserable, poor copy of the real one, and then start to scratch our heads and say, ooh, then what made the real one?
There's some of the corn stalks in a crop circle. The electromagnetic field and the ones outside have north and north-south. But the ones inside the circle, the polarity is reversed.
Yes. Now, this again would suggest to me that either some very, very bright experimental scientist from our lot has either experimented with something which would be able to reverse polarity in that way, or that somebody from out there, or even from up here, is telling us there is a way to do this, you don't yet know it, it is the signature of a superior technology. Time for one more, so Dave tells me. Yes?
So, what is the truth of what happened at Roswell in 1957?
Oh, we should know. We were there. We will tell you what we found out. I have to keep a promise to a man by the name of Dennis Balthazar, who was in charge of the Roswell Research Centre and Museum. We arrived at Roswell and met Dennis, who was in charge, showed us everything, introduced us to a number of venerable ladies and gentlemen who had been there when it was, all happening in the late 40s. And then he told us this story, which is the one I promised to share with every audience to whom I told the tale of Roswell, as Dennis's insurance. He said he received a phone call from a young man who said, my father was a security man when it happened. He saw two aliens, one alive, one dead, being taken away by rather sinister gentlemen from a political centre. And he said, my father was threatened that if he said a word, not only would they kill him, they would kill all the rest of his family as well, and we would disappear in the desert of New Mexico and nobody would ever know what had happened to us. And he said, because my father loved us, he kept his trap shut. And he said, he is now terminally ill. Mother had already predeceased him, so there's nothing else to worry about. So he told his son what had happened. And the boy said, Mr. Balthazar, that's the truth. That's what my father said. So he said, okay, can you come along and can I come and see your father and get it from him first hand? Fine. He never heard another word except for one garbled, terrified phone call. Forget I said anything. Please, please, forget I said anything. We never spoke about it. It just never happened. Please, please. And Dennis said, I tell this to all my visitors. So if anything happens to Dennis Balthazar, I want the world to know I've kept my promise. Got to stop there, Dave says.
Afraid so.
Yeah, okay.
Because I'm going to get you back before the motorway gets trained again.
Yeah, okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's all.
Yeah.